On a day when winter seemed to cling to the calendar with frozen claws, a handful of figures stood defiant against the gale on Greenland's forsaken eastern shore. The month was June, 1931, but the landscape was a study in perpetual January. Wind, sharp as shattered glass, howled from the continental ice sheet, tearing at their caribou skin parkas. To their backs lay an endless, lifeless white plain. Before them stretched the heaving, iron-gray tumult of the North Atlantic. They were not soldiers, but men forged by a harder existence. Trappers, hunters, wanderers of the void, their faces a roadmap of grit etched by blizzards and salt spray. At their head was a Norwegian named Halvard Nansen de Vald. He stepped toward a rough-hewn pole planted in the coastal scree near their shelter at Migbukta, Mosquito Bay. With fingers numb beneath his mittens, he hoisted a banner. It was not Denmark's crimson and white Dannebrog. It was Norway's blue cross blazing against a field of scarlet. As the fabric cracked like gunfire in the wind, Nansen de Vald raised his voice against the emptiness. "In the name of the king, from this point I proclaim for Norway all lands south and north, the realm of Eirik the Red." With that declaration whispered away by the Arctic gust, he performed an act of geopolitical alchemy, transforming, in words alone, a territory rivaling France in size from Danish claim to Norwegian possession. A coded radio pulse traveled from their makeshift station, leaping oceans to Oslo. The message did not trigger alarm, it ignited jubilation. Norway celebrated, sensing the recovery of a legacy long deferred. In Copenhagen, however, the news detonated with silent, seismic force. Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning, a pragmatic socialist who wore his beard like a badge of sober compromise, now faced a casus belli. A fraternal nation had seized sovereign soil. Cartographers rushed to print new atlases, carving a Norwegian wedge from Danish Greenland. The world watched, anticipating the rattle of anchors and the mobilization of frigates. But Denmark orchestrated a move that confounded every expectation. They sent no fleet, no marines. They dispatched a brigade of barristers. The cannon they would fire was a lawsuit. This is the chronicle of the Arctic's most peculiar conflict. It is a tale of two sibling kingdoms nearly severed by a frozen wedge of earth, of a neglected treaty and a whiskey-laced assurance, of a courtroom duel that determined ownership of the world's roof. It is the singular instance in history where a continent's fate was adjudicated, not conquered. To comprehend why those 5 Norwegians raised that flag, one must journey back a millennium to a national scar buried deep in the Norwegian psyche. To them, Greenland was never Danish. It was a Norse heirloom, lost to a drawer of history. Eirik the Red, who planted the first settlement in 982, was a Norwegian outcast. The Viking communities that thrived for 500 years were outposts of Norway, speaking its tongue, paying homage to its crown. Greenland was the western jewel in the Norgesveldet, the medieval Norwegian realm. History, however, is a capricious curator. The 14th century Black Death eviscerated Norway, leaving it a ghost of itself, compelled into the Kalmar Union with Denmark. For 4 centuries, Norway dwelt in Denmark's shadow, its capital in Copenhagen, its voice subdued. And when Norway slept, its imperial possessions, Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Isles, drifted into Danish custodianship. Then came the Napoleonic reordering of Europe. Denmark's alliance with Bonaparte proved a catastrophic bet. In the punitive 1814 Treaty of Kiel, the victorious powers severed Norway from Denmark and gifted it to Sweden. Yet Danish negotiators with sly precision inserted a clause. While Norway itself was forfeit, the overseas territories of the Norwegian crown would remain with Denmark. The Swedish and Norwegian delegates, perhaps weary, perhaps dismissive of distant glacial rocks, affixed their seals. With that flourish of a pen, Norway's maritime empire vanished. The nation awoke to independence from Denmark only to be wed to Sweden, and in the process was stripped of its historical appendages. This loss festered, a quiet rot in the national heart. Norwegians watched as Denmark garnered prestige from Viking lore and profit from Greenlandic trade. By the dawn of the 20th century, Norway had finally parted from Sweden, and a revitalized nationalism surged. A new generation scanned maps with a burning sense of grievance. Their gaze settled on East Greenland, a void. Denmark's presence was anchored to the inhabited west coast. The east was a monumental emptiness of glacier and stone, inhabited only by polar bears and gales. Danish authority there was a phantom. Into this vacuum moved Norwegian hunters. Throughout the 1920s, men like Halvard Nansen de Vald sailed east, building cabins, trapping fox and bear, christening fjords with Norwegian names. They championed a legal doctrine, terra nullius, land belonging to no one. Their argument was blunt. Sovereignty required occupation. If Denmark could not police, settle, or administer this coast, then their claim was parchment thin. The land was open for the taking. Tensions crystallized in 1930. Denmark, sensing the encroachment, declared all Greenland a closed country, demanding permits from any foreign vessels seeking to land. To the Norwegian trappers, this was a gauntlet thrown down. Their outrage found powerful ears in Oslo, including those of Defense Minister Vidkun Quisling, a fervent nationalist whose name would later become an epithet for betrayal. Quisling argued that if Norway did not act now, the opportunity would be lost forever. Nansen Devold resolved to force the state's hand. The flag raising at Mygbukta was a calculated provocation, designed to create an irreversible fact. His calculus proved correct. When word reached Oslo, public fervor forced the government's move. On July 10, 1931, a royal decree formalized the annexation. The map, at least in Norwegian eyes, was redrawn. In Copenhagen, the response was glacial fury. Yet Stauning was a realist. A naval clash in the pack ice would be a futile, catastrophic folly. He possessed a more potent weapon, the nascent architecture of international order. In the wake of the Great War's slaughter, the world had established the Permanent Court of International Justice in The Hague, a temple for the civilized settlement of disputes. Stauning placed Denmark's entire wager upon its bench. Denmark sued, demanding the annexation be voided and its sovereignty over all Greenland affirmed. The gamble was staggering. Arctic law was uncharted water. A loss could mean the dissolution of the Danish realm. Thus began the most extraordinary arms race of the era, an arms race of archivists. Both nations assembled teams not of generals, but of historians and jurists. Their ammunition was parchment, their fortifications filing cabinets. They scoured Europe's libraries for medieval maps, forgotten treaties, any fragment of proof. The Danish legal corps, a constellation of intellectual brilliance, sought to prove two pillars: Denmark's continuous will to act as sovereign over the entire island, and other nations' historical acquiescence to that claim. Their search unearthed a skeleton in the diplomatic closet, a memo from 1919. It recorded a casual conversation over spirits between the Danish foreign minister and his Norwegian counterpart, Niels Claus Eichelin. The Danish note stated that when probed on extending Danish sovereignty over Greenland, Eichelin had replied his government would make no difficulties. It was an informal verbal pledge, yet in the sacramental world of diplomacy, such words could be binding. The Eichelin Declaration became Denmark's concealed trump card. Norway, meanwhile, brimmed with confidence. Their case rested on the self-evident truth of terra nullius. How could Denmark claim what it did not touch? They portrayed Denmark as an absentee landlord claiming a continent. As the trial date neared, Scandinavia simmered. Boycotts soured trade, newspapers fanned the flames of nationalism. Yet in The Hague's Peace Palace, 15 judges from across the globe, from Japan to Cuba, prepared to weigh arguments devoid of patriotic sentiment. The courtroom drama unfolded in 1932. The world watched, knowing the precedent would resonate from the Arctic to the Antarctic. The Danish advocate presented his history with methodical calm, then revealed the Eichelin Declaration. A foreign minister's word, he contended, was his nation's bond. The Norwegian team reeled. They dismissed the exchange as informal, unauthorized, inconsequential. But the blow had landed. The judges retired to deliberate, their task to distill a century of rivalry into a verdict. At Mygbukta, Nansen Devold and his men endured the polar night, their flag a lonely defiance. They patrolled their claimed territory, dreaming of Norwegian harbors and settlements, unaware their destiny was being decided by men in judicial robes an ocean away. On April 5, 1933, the court reconvened. President Minakiro Adachi of Japan began to read. The judgment systematically dismantled Norway's position. History favored Denmark. The Treaty of Kiel was binding. Crucially, the court ruled that for polar realms, the threshold for effective occupation was different. Sovereignty could be demonstrated through legislative acts, scientific expeditions, and the intent to govern, not solely by physical habitation of every fjord. Finally, they addressed the Eichelin Declaration. The court was unequivocal. A pledge from a foreign minister, even informally given, was binding upon his state. Norway had given its word, then broken it. The vote was 12-2. Norway's occupation was illegal. Greenland, in its entirety, belonged to Denmark. Copenhagen erupted in vindicated joy. Oslo absorbed the verdict as a profound national humiliation. Yet then occurred the remarkable testament to Nordic civility. Norway complied. The government, swallowing its pride, ordered the flag at Mygbukta lowered. Nansen Devold and his men, their dream extinguished, carefully took down their banner and departed. The conflict ended not with a truce, but with a court order. The legacy of this legal war, however, was just beginning. The Eastern Greenland case became the bedrock of modern territorial law. It established that sovereignty could extend over uninhabited wastes through demonstration of state will, a principle that today underpins the claims of nations from Canada to Russia. It solidified Denmark's hold on Greenland, ensuring its unity through the strategic crucible of the Cold War. The case held poignant ironies. Vidkun Quisling's bitterness over the defeat festered, contributing to his later radicalization and ultimate treason as Hitler's puppet in Norway. The Inuit of Greenland, unconsulted in the European quarrel, found their homeland preserved as a single entity, avoiding a partition that might have fractured their cultural continuity. Today, the cabin at Migbukta remains, a windswept relic of ambition. The true monument, however, is invisible, the border that encircles Greenland on every map. That line exists because of the clash of briefs in 1933. It reminds us that the contours of our world are often drawn in ink, not blood, that history pivots on forgotten promises and meticulous argument. The Dannebrog still flies over East Greenland's weather stations, snapping in the same wind that once chilled Havard Nansen Duvald's face. It flies with the quiet authority of law. A continent was secured, and the only casualty was a brother nation's pride. This was the lawsuit war, a conflict without casualties, yet with a victor who took it all. Enduring proof that in the theater of geopolitics, the most formidable weapon can be a meticulously crafted argument. This is the cinematic chronicle. Subscribe to journey deeper into the stories where history's tides were turned not on battlefields, but in the quiet, decisive chambers where the future is argued into being.